Hello and welcome to this special interview with Dr. Mike Tildesley. My name is Cam Hall, the head of news here at Raw 12:51 AM. And as we come to the end of what has been a very busy term one for many of us, and as we look forward to the Christmas break, of course, coronavirus still continues to dominate a lot of the discourse and a lot of the discussion, not just had here with the student community at Warwick, but much more widely throughout the community as well. And of course, the new Omicron variant as well that has recently emerged, with cases increasing in the UK. At the time of recording on the morning of Wednesday, the 8th of December, 437 cases of the Omicron variant, with 101 discovered in the last 24 hours. Important to say, these are confirmed cases. Many scientists and epidemiologists have said that these cases are expected to be higher. And of course, with new restrictions and potential new restrictions as well, a lot to discuss as we go into the Christmas break, especially with a lot of the increased socializing we're expected to see. Well, let's bring in, as ever, Dr. Mike Tildesley, who sits on SPI-M, one of the boards advising the government, and is an epidemiologist here as well at Warwick University. Dr. Mike Tildesley, thank you for joining me.
No problem at all. Good morning.
It's fantastic to have you. So let's start off with Omicron. And specifically right now, I think it's important to say we are still very much in the early stages of discovering just exactly what threat this variant poses. But perhaps based on what we know so far, how can you quantify the threat, or what is the threat so far posed by Omicron?
Well, it's really challenging, actually. Now, of course, I mean, the situation we were in, we started to see a week or two ago really concerning emerging of sort of a rapid growth rate of this variant in South Africa, in one particular province in South Africa, mainly in younger people initially. And of course, this was a concern. South Africa has a relatively small population of individuals who are vaccinated. Around about 25% have had 2 doses. So, of course, that was a concern. It was in a situation where low vaccine coverage and rapid spreading of the variant. Unfortunately, at the point that you detect a variant, it's probably already had an opportunity to move to other parts of the world. And of course, we have started to see that here, that we are getting a growing number of cases of Omicron variant in the UK now. But there is still an awful lot of uncertainty. I think we're pretty confident that it is probably more transmissible than the Delta variant, which is the one that's dominant in the UK at the moment. And over time, it may very well become the dominant variant in the UK. But there's still some uncertainties around how worried we should be. We still don't know categorically how effective the vaccines are going to be. And again, you see reports that come out that suggest that the vaccines might not be as effective. And then there are some suggestions that actually this variant may be less severe than the Delta variant, that there haven't been reports of people going to hospital as yet. So all of these things we need to work to try to resolve. Now, this, we'll get much more information about this over the next couple of weeks when we start to see it become more widespread in the UK. And hopefully that will put us in a better position to try to inform policy regarding the need or not for any additional measures.
Indeed, and perhaps obviously moving to your role now as an epidemiologist and building upon what you just said there. As an epidemiologist, as someone who's going to be building the data models and perhaps suggesting government policy, what exactly do we know so far? And I guess from your perspective as well, what more do you need to find out to be able to make policy recommendations about the Omicron variant?
Well, I think I would say there's still an awful lot that we don't know, and that's the key thing. We are, of course, seeing cases emerging in the UK, and it does appear to be growing faster than Delta, and possibly in the longer term will replace Delta as the dominant variant. But actually, it's really important to determine how fast it's growing. There's still some uncertainty around that. But last week, when we were starting to gather data on this, a lot of the cases that were being reported did appear to be associated with travel, with incoming travellers. And of course, that means that you can't really confidently accurately sort of parameterize the growth rate because, of course, it's muddied by the fact that international travellers are coming in. When it starts to spread in the community, you get a much better sense of how fast it is actually growing. And that's going to take a week or two before we can really establish that. That, of course, is not the only important thing. We do need to look at how effective we think the vaccines might be, because then that informs us to what we think the pressure might be on the NHS. And of course, coming into that, as I've said, is the severity. Really important for us to understand, Is it true, these early reports that we're hearing, that symptoms might be less severe? How will that be when actually the older generation, the older and more vulnerable people get infected? Is the same true? Because as I said, in South Africa, a lot of younger people were initially infected, and they're the ones that are less likely to get sick anyway when they get infected with COVID. So we need a little bit more time to really fully establish all of the parameters around this variant so that we can parameterize our models accordingly and really get a sense of where we might expect to be as we move further into the winter.
I think time is something that has certainly been pressed by many within the government when, of course, they introduced the latest restrictions a few weeks ago now. Let's move on to vaccines, because I know certainly when we last talked at the end of June, vaccination was something that you were certainly pressing. And indeed, many within the government, many scientific advisors, indeed across the political spectrum, have been emphasizing the significance of vaccination as one of the most important tools in our armor against COVID. And indeed, this morning, we're recording this interview on the first anniversary of the first vaccination in the UK, in the University Hospital of Coventry. And indeed, you mentioned significantly lower vaccination rates in South Africa. Of course, here in the UK, we've got considerably higher vaccination rates. As of the 7th of December, 88.9% of people have received their first dose, 81% of eligible people have received their second dose, and 36.4% eligible people have received their booster vaccine. The government have been pressing the booster vaccination campaign as essential to tackling the Omicron variant right now. Looking perhaps just staying with that booster campaign quickly, do you see this based upon the data we have so far? How effective do you think emphasizing booster vaccinations is against the Omicron variant?
Well, I think the key thing in all of that is that we should still say that vaccines still play a very, very crucial role. No one is suggesting for a second that all of a sudden the vaccines aren't going to work overnight when the Omicron variant takes hold in the UK. It may be that they are less effective. We have to remember that when Delta came in, there was a suggestion that actually the vaccines would be a little bit less effective than they were for Alpha. So this is something that we might expect over time, that new variants are a little bit better at evading the vaccines, and in the longer term, we might have to tweak the vaccines to combat whatever is circulating. But as I said, no one is suggesting all of a sudden they will stop working. So the booster vaccination campaign is still really the major weapon in our arsenal to deal with the Omicron variant. Really important that we accelerate this over the winter. And I think as of today, I think everyone over 40 is now eligible to book. And hopefully over the coming weeks, that will start working down the adult age groups, because of course, the plan is, I think, by the end of January to hopefully have given all eligible adults their booster dose. So really important that we do that. If we get very high coverage, then hopefully, even if we start to see this variant spreading widely, we should really minimize the risk of individuals developing severe disease. So that's very, very important. But then going back to the uncertainty, we then have this key uncertainty of, how effective are they going to be against Omicron, these vaccines? And that is something that we still don't 100% know, and we really need to work to try to resolve the uncertainty around over the next few weeks.
Indeed, it is certainly my New Year's resolution that once I can book my booster jab, I will be making sure to get that. Just last thing on Omicron quickly, and particularly on vaccinations as well. There were a lot of fears, certainly, when Omicron first emerged, about it being an immune-escaping variant to the vaccinations. And of course, we made considerable progress on vaccines over the last year. But from an epidemiological perspective, just what exactly would the impact of an immune-escaping variant be?
Yeah, so there were a lot of concerns, particularly because with this variant, there's an awful lot of mutations compared with other variants that were circulating. Several of these to this spike protein, which is a sort of covers the virus, and it's the one that kind of helps it get into the cells. And there was a real concern that this might mean that the vaccines would be less effective. Now, of course, if you do have a variant that does evade the vaccines in a significant way, then of course what this does is that this means that more people will get infected, and a proportion of those will sadly go to hospital and will even more sadly die from infection. And so this is why the level of immunity from vaccines is really, really important. It is worth bearing in mind, though, that for the vast majority of vaccines that you will ever have in your life, they do not give you lifelong immunity. I mean, even things like, tetanus, you have to have a tetanus jab every 10 years. And so that is something that we have grown used to, that for many viruses or whatever we are protecting against, we go back and we have to have another vaccine at some point in the future. Influenza, we have to have a jab, those of us that are eligible, every year to protect against whatever is circulating. So this is probably the long-term forecast for COVID, that we will have boosters every 6 months or every year to combat whatever is circulating. And hopefully, when we understand more and more about this virus, we will get better and better at preparing vaccines that will have high levels of protection against whatever is circulating.
Well, let's move on now. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the Omicron variant, and of course, the Omicron variant has put a lot of uncertainty over Christmas. Of course, for many people last year, myself included, we were moved into tier 4 a week before Christmas, and the plans that we had for limited socializing that was permitted by the government over Christmas last year were all eventually cancelled. And certainly from within the government, there's been a real emphasis to avoid that same situation this year and to avoid what many have dubbed as the cancellation of Christmas. There has been some concern, and Dr. Jenny Harris was talking about this last week, saying that all unnecessary socializing should be stopped in the run-up to Christmas. Do you see, from an epidemiological perspective, that the current Christmas socializing should continue as normal?
I think this is a really difficult one. And I think in a sense, if all you care about is epidemiology, then, I always say, and I know this sounds flippant, but if you only care about COVID, then you're always going to recommend the severest restrictions possible, because that's the safest thing to do from a COVID health perspective. The problem, of course, we have is we've had some level of restrictions now for 18 months or more, and we all know what happened last year, that obviously we had the November lockdown and then we emerged back into tiers. And I also know people who ended up in tier 4 in the run up to Christmas and had severe issues in terms of who they could spend Christmas with. And I think this was a real difficulty, that it was really damaging to a lot of people's mental health and well-being. And we do need to bear that in mind when we're thinking about the situation over the coming months in terms of the need or not for more restrictions. Hopefully, and I think this is, there is a lot of uncertainty, as I've said, about Omicron, but hopefully over the next couple of weeks, we are in a reasonable place, and with the success of the booster vaccination campaigns, we can not have the situation we had last year. We are in a very different place from last year with high levels of vaccination, and we do need to remember that. So my hope is that we can exercise a level of common sense, and it may be that the large-scale Christmas parties are not happening. We've seen a number of those cancelled already. It may be that those are not happening, but actually the opportunity to be with family and loved ones over Christmas, which didn't happen last year for many, many people, will still be on the cards. And I think it's really important that we try to make that happen for people's mental health and well-being.
Indeed, and certainly one thing that I think perhaps follows on from this, and we've heard a lot of discussion about learning to live with COVID, what exactly that means. And certainly the suggestion perhaps that the reintroduction of restrictions goes against the spirit of learning to live and adapt to coronavirus. Indeed, Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, spoke earlier this week in the House of Commons, and she said, specifically focusing upon restrictions in response to Omicron, she said that based upon, admittedly, a lot of uncertain data so far, but saying, sure, a more transmissible but potentially less lethal virus, if the response is to go back into restrictions, if the response is to shut down potentially or undermine parts of the economy, as she put it, this, in her eyes, isn't learning to live with COVID. Do you agree with the former Prime Minister there?
Well, I think there is an argument for that. And I think, we do need to think about this going forward. Now, the problem, of course, we have at the moment with Omicron is that we still have hospitals under severe pressure. And of course, that's a concern. So if there is a level of uncertainty, then I can understand the need to put certain measures in place now. But if we're thinking about going forward, in the months and years to come, we can't shut down the country every time there's a new variant emerging with a level of uncertainty, because we know that that is damaging as well. Actually, one of my main areas of research, actually, both before and during the pandemic, was looking at determining an optimal control policy where you take into account not only the direct impact of the virus, but also the indirect impact as a result of control. And I can give you a really flippant example of this in a way that, if you only let's look at lockdowns, right? If you only care about the virus itself, then, and you put, try and optimize a policy in a model, it's always going to come out from the model at the end that the optimal policy is to stay in lockdown forever. But on the flip side, if you only care about the economy and you do the same thing and put this into the model, then of course the optimal policy will always be don't put in any restrictions and, will allow lots of people to get infected. Now, of course, you don't want either of those. And in fact, the reality is somewhere in the middle, that actually what you want to do is balance harms. You want to balance the harms as a result of the virus and also balance the long-term harms, not just to the economy, but also to, say, children's education if schools have to close, and to mental health and well-being. And I think this is really important in the longer term in terms of living with COVID, that we need to try and quantify overall harms, and then we can put in an approach for new variants in the future that really balance those, so that any measures that are put in really are at the right level to balance all of these risks and harms.
Indeed, certainly that balance of risk is something I know has been discussed a lot on this point. Let's now, though, move on to obviously a big theme, obviously coming towards the end of term, coming towards the end of the year. Perhaps just looking back very quickly at 2021 and the coronavirus, just how much progress would you say we've made over the last year?
Well, I think actually we've made an awful lot of progress. We need to remember, I mean, you just reminded me on this interview, Cam, that it's a year today since Margaret Keenan got the first dose of vaccine in University Hospital. And if we go back 12 months ago and think where we were, at that point, we had no idea what would happen with the vaccination campaign. And actually, we can all criticize certain decisions that have happened since the start of the pandemic, but actually, I think the vaccination campaign has been credible. I think that's one thing that we can say was really a leading light in our response. So to go on 12 months from there and look at the high levels of vaccination across the population, the booster vaccination campaign that's rolling out. I mean, it's by no means perfect. We still are seeing that, unfortunately, there is some disparity between areas of the country that have high vaccine coverage and certain communities that don't, and that is a worry. But actually, the progress that the vaccination campaign has made is incredible. And actually, people's response as well in terms of intervention measures has also been pretty incredible. I think generally, we tend to see the high-profile cases of people breaking lockdown rules, but actually, I think in the main, the public response has been overwhelming in terms of the way that people have got behind these measures. We do, of course, going forward, as I've said, need to think about how we're going to balance all of this to really support people after a really tough couple of years. But I do think we're in a much better place than where we were this time last year. And hopefully 2022 will be another step in the right direction.
Indeed, I think we can all hope for that. Just one last question on 2021. And indeed, there's been a lot of discussion over the last month. And before the Omicron variant emerged, we saw a significant rise in cases across Europe. And we saw restrictions, for example, lockdowns or partial lockdowns being reimposed in Austria and the Netherlands and across parts of Germany as well. And there had been a lot of discussion that the UK's relaxing of restrictions, the Freedom Day on July 19th, accepting a significantly higher number of cases throughout September, October, could potentially have avoided the situation seen in Austria and the Netherlands where cases were lower, but then suddenly increased. Do you see this exit wave perhaps as not necessarily a success, but a correct policy for dealing with coronavirus at the time?
Yeah, and I mean, there has been some criticism actually about our policy in a sense that what we've done really is almost for the past few months had the R number bubbling around 1 with a very high number of cases, but actually a very low number of, comparatively compared to where we were at the peak, a relatively low number of hospital admissions and a relatively low number of deaths compared with where we were at the peak. Now, we did see, of course, as we went through August into September, a lot of infections in younger people, a lot of infections in secondary school children when they went back in September. And then the suggestion that actually, when we got beyond the school half terms, that actually we're not seeing similar numbers of cases in secondary school children, potentially because actually they've got high levels of immunity now, coupled with, of course, increasing levels of vaccination in that age group. And because of that, it may very well be that, as you've said, that has led to not having a big surge in cases as we moved into the winter. But of course, we've remained very, very high. Other countries have been a little bit more cautious. And of course, as it's got to the colder weather, people have mixed more indoors. And in some of those countries, actually, the vaccination campaign has been a little bit behind where we are as well. That's led to bigger waves of infection and a reintroduction of restrictions. I suspect that people will have very, very different ideas of whether they think our policy was a good one or not. But I think what we have to view it in is to where we are going forward. And that really has to be focusing on that booster vaccination campaign. And of course, keeping one eye on what's going on in hospitals to make sure that we aren't getting a surge in NHS admissions as we move into the winter as a result of this variant.
Okay, well, just one last question, of course, talking there about 2021. Let's finish on 2022 and in particular term 2 this year. Now, the university announced earlier in the term that they were removing social distancing restrictions, which would potentially allow for the return of in-person lectures on campus. Obviously, we've had the Omicron variant emerge since then. We know that there have been a tightening of face covering restrictions as well across campus. Obviously, we've said throughout this interview, there's a lot of uncertainty thus far about the Omicron variant, but perhaps based upon what we know so far, do you anticipate that the university may go back on removing social distancing restrictions next term?
That's a really hard one to call, and I'm not sure I'd like to hang my hat on what I think they will or will not do. I think they and all institutes across the country need to be responsive to whatever's happening. We've got 2 or 3 more weeks before we're really going to properly understand what's going on with the Omicron variant, and we'll have a much better idea what the risk will be when students start to go back to campuses in January. And I think, as I said, the university has to just be responsive to what we see in the data. It's really too early to tell. One thing I will say is I was a little bit worried about the idea of we could go back to full occupancy offices provided everyone wears masks, which always kind of goes against what I believe in terms of, masks are an additional measure to maintaining social distancing. They're not a substitute for social distancing. And I think we all do need to bear that in mind, that if we are in an environment where it's deemed that we need to have masks indoors in offices, then in my opinion, we're also in an environment where we need to have social distancing. It's not one or the other. So I really hope we can get it to a place in the not too distant future that we can remove all of these restrictions and get back to normal. But I feel we're not quite there yet, and we really need to have one eye or both eyes on the data, shall we say, over the next few weeks to really determine where we are.
Well, Dr. Mike Tildesley, it has been fantastic to talk to you this morning. Thank you so much.
No problem at all.
And as ever, there are plenty of ways, of course, you can keep up with all of our coverage here on Raw Talk 51am and here within the news department. Of course, follow us on social media, on Facebook at Raw News, Instagram, Raw 1251 News, and at Raw News Warwick on Twitter as well. We've got a lot of plans coming ahead for 2022. So please make sure to follow us to stay tuned for everything that we've got. And thanks so much for watching, and looking forward to seeing you again in 2022.
Across campus, online, and on 1251 AM. This is your student radio station.